Hi guys. I'm here to talk about satire. Well, me and River, she decided to join in on the video. Here she is. I think she's thinking about eating my shoes, but another video on that later. For now, I wanted to talk to you guys about satire. You guys are deep into our first module on satire. We're going to do 2 modules. We've got part 1 and part 2. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but I think satire is really fun. It's incredibly relevant to our day and age, and it has been for a while. I think in American culture, satirical comedy is huge. I mean, how many movies can you think of that you love that involve satire of some sort or another, or even, satirical cartoons, all that. So it's really fun when we get into this unit. But I wanted to make a few observations or offer a few observations just to kind of help provide some context and clarity about this. Maybe just share some of my thoughts about satire. So one of my first thoughts, I wrote them down. One of my first thoughts is, 1, I love it. Okay, check. I hope you do too. Check. But I also want to acknowledge that when your teacher asks you to start analyzing satire, it can feel like it loses some of its funny, right? Like some of the magic kind of contracts. You're like, oh, it's not as funny anymore, because now it's a little bit more serious and you're having to dig for the message or the criticism inside of the satire. And I totally understand that changes the chemistry of the experience. I acknowledge this. But I also feel like it's a good trade-off in some ways, because the more that you analyze it, you can also begin to truly appreciate what the rhetorician, or in this case, this satirist, is attempting to argue. And that can be very powerful to really be able to point to like what these great comedians and satirists of our day and age are really trying to say, which is something we'll go back to next week. What else can I... something else I wanted to say about satire is that one of its most profound rhetorical strengths is that it's very disarming, right? So if you can get your audience or your listeners to laugh, it releases tension, right? And this is, of course, assuming that this is satire that that is intended to make you laugh. But when people laugh, right, it's like it gets a little oxygen around maybe an issue that's very stressful and controversial for people. But of course, not all satire is intended to make you laugh. Some of it's supposed to make you think or kind of shock you. So that's something else to think about when it comes to satire. What else? Okay, so I want to spend a little time on Swift with you, because you made it through. I hope you made it through. And I tried to narrate my story about reading Swift for the first time in 7th grade. That was really sad for me when I was 13. I legit thought my language arts teacher was trying to tell us that eating babies is what we were going to be doing. I didn't really understand. I was 13, right? But I think even now, if someone like dropped a Modest Proposal on you to read without any context at all, it'd be confusing. Which is why it's interesting to think about satire isn't always just funny. That can be something that's very much a cultural branding of American satire, but there are other forms of satire from different cultures and different historical moments that don't necessarily have the same recipe. So that's something to think about, is like when you're reading A Modest Proposal, is Jonathan Swift attempting to be funny? Right? I don't know so much. He could be actually very serious. That underneath his absurdity, this absurd idea of eating children to stave off mass poverty in Ireland, he's actually being incredibly critical of England and their policies and treatment of the Irish. Another thing that I want to point out after reading Swift is I know that the vernacular or the language that he's using, it seems kind of archaic. I totally get that. That was another thing that threw me when I first read it. and initially I thought like, well, he has to be serious because it's written in like super fancy old English. So this must be a real proposal. You can see the confusion. It's not, because even in his day and age, sarcasm was alive and well. Human beings have been using sarcasm for a long time, and irony to get their points across. So that's something to consider. I think very often in our culture, or any culture, I think we assume that because it's entertaining and delightful to us, we must have invented these mechanisms or these strategies. I know that I've had that bias, and I've had to go back and examine like, oh no, like people have been making jokes all over the place, all over the world, in different cultures and different times, everywhere, including in 1729, Jonathan Swift is being kind of funky, satirical in his piece. The other thing that can be tough about satire is it's very much of the moment. So if you think about our history today, right, we're living through a pandemic on top of an incredibly controversial election season, on top of intense protests, civil rights issues. I mean, there's a lot going on. And paired with that is a lot of satire. There's a lot of people producing satirical content. You can find it on the internet real fast, and they're producing it on different streaming platforms. But it would be hard to translate. Let's say if we went back in time and showed a piece of comedy written today, pre-pandemic, the comedy wouldn't translate very well because satire is very much of this moment. And even if you fast forwarded 20 years and looked at an SNL sketch or a South Park episode, again, the funny might not translate because it's invention of its moment, right? It's like it's of its time. So that's why it can be tough to read a satirical piece, even like Jonathan Swift's from before. So if you're like, well, I don't get it, it's okay. Sometimes satire is something that you have to be swimming in because you're swimming in the culture from which it's produced, if that makes sense. What's my other point? Oh, so that's something else I wanted. These are all a random collection of thoughts. I hope that's okay. The other thing I wanted to say is that, weirdly enough, when Jonathan Swift published A Modest Proposal, it was on like a little like pamphlet or treatise that got like printed and pushed out into society. People actually thought he meant it. So even sometimes in your own moment, using your own language, people may not get the satire. And that's the biggest joke of all, is that if there were some people living in England at that time, like, hey, maybe eating Irish babies is a good idea. I'm laughing, but those people were so deeply set inside of their own prejudices that they don't realize how absurd that is, right? That's crazy. So sometimes satire does such a good job that it reveals people's worst, as it's meant to, vices and stupidities, right? And that can be a little tragic. There's something actually, instead of just funny about that, there's something really sad about that. Okay, so this is going on for a long time. I'm hoping this helps you guys. If you have any more questions about satire, or you feel like you want to talk about it, or you want a Zoom call about it, please let me know. I can set up a class session. We can just like talk about how great it is, or maybe even how complex it is to analyze. But I'm hoping you're enjoying what's in front of you so far with this module. I really enjoyed putting it together. And I'm gonna let River say my goodbye. She's a big satire fan, aren't you, baby? You love it? Okay. Bye, guys. Have a great week.